This is the best way to play the reworked Sombra in Overwatch 2. Sombra is a mid-range flanker with 3 key things to keep in mind. When, where, and who are you pressuring? In terms of when, you'll typically be timing your pressure just after your team push. In terms of where it's from, it needs to be with cover and usually with distance if you outrange your targets. But that's the thing, who is the target that you'll be pressuring? In short, that comes down to range. Basically, if they outrange you, like a Widow, Ana, Zen, Ashe or Hanzo, that's who you'll be focusing. But if they're running something like a Lucio, Moira, Reaper, Tracer, then you'll likely be farming their tank, like we saw in the Malga comp, or playing for map control and taking 2v1s on their Tracer. Sombra's weapon, Lil Uzi Verts, makes Sombra shoot her SMG at 1200 rounds per minute, dealing 8 damage per shot with an ammo capacity of 60 rounds. Your normal DPS is 160, which, for comparison, Tracer's DPS is currently 220. The main usage of your Uzi will actually be trying to utilize the range as much as you can. Now again, this does dip into the playstyle section, but against comps you outrange, like Winston, Lucio, Kiri, you can even be standing as far as 20 meters away, poking down a tank, with the majority of your shots landing. The only additional thing specific to your Uzi is just to remember to reload while you're passively in Invis. It's a small thing, but it's kind of a bad habit, like reloading too much on Zarya. Other stuff on your Uzi, like uptime, will be mentioned in the positional section. Sombra's first ability, TF2 Engineer Teleporter, makes Sombra toss out a beacon that makes her travel up to 18 meters. The stealth cooldown is reduced after you throw it, and the cooldown on the Translocator is 5 seconds. Speaking of your stealth, that is important to talk about too, it's now your passive on a 3.5 second cooldown with a 4 meter detection radius, a 45% increase in movement speed, and of course, you're completely invisible. Because the Translocator is much less of a set and forget kind of ability, the advice around it has changed quite a bit. The most obvious use case is as some kind of escape ability, and that's not particularly revolutionary. I think a bronze player could tell you to throw your Translocator when you need to leave. However, there are more layers to this. The first is making sure your escape isn't too long or too far away, and you have some kind of planned mental route out. In other words, don't go in without an expectation to get out. The next layer is understanding what makes a good escape route. The first is cover. There's been many times where I've been playing against Sombras, they throw their Translocator in open space, and then I tag them and kill them, even though they do try and escape. Highground also counts as a piece of cover, and especially if you're playing against heroes that lack verticality, you need to be doing this. Kiting back to Highground is very underrated. And lastly, throwing your Translocator into the enemy team. I'm actually glad Question brought this up in his 5 tips video, because it aligns a lot with the video I recently made about aggression and how you can play very safe and very aggressive at the same time.
It can actually be better to be invisible in enemy lines than be visible in your own friendly lines. This means sometimes translocating straight up, sometimes deeper into enemy territory, or just right at your feet. You're safe when the enemy stops shooting at you. If you only think you're safe when you're far away, then you're probably going to spend a lot of time walking towards and away from where you need to be.
There is one exception to what Question says though, and that's against high mobility comps. In other words, generally speaking, if you kite into the enemy team, you're gonna get hunted down by mobile heroes like Doomfist, Tracer, and Sombra. Echo and Genji to lesser extents too. So I only really recommend doing this if you've got high ground to kite back to, so it's harder for people to chase you, or just doing this against the low mobility comps. Again, this can be super counterintuitive. You'd think that throwing your Translocator into the enemy team is more dangerous, but a common saying I have is that whenever you stack down main, you take more damage, and you deal less of it too. There's also using Translocator to just re-enter stealth quickly after a kill. Again, Question talked about this in his 5 tips video, and I can concur. Waiting 3 seconds after a kill is just too long, and you'll get your Translocator back in time for your next re-engage anyways. A tip similar to that is actually using Translocator to stage and take high ground. Yes, on paper, using your escape ability to reach high ground isn't that smart of an idea, but it's kinda similar to the staging stuff I talked about in my venture guide. In other words, if nobody is using the high ground, and you can safely take advantage of it, please do so. For instance, here on Gibraltar, after I force out the Doomfist, I translocate to high ground and go on the Kiriko. Nobody is using the airship, so I can safely move to it, and by the time I drop and force out the Kiriko, I'm gonna get my Translocator back, which is what happens. I'll refer back to this clip for multiple reasons at the end of this video. Aside from that, there's not too much else to your Translocator. There's some niche uses to avoid damage like Riptire or Diva Bomb, but apart from that, it's just a fairly nuanced escape ability. Sombra's second ability, COVID-19, makes Sombra toss out a projectile that deals 25 damage on impact, 50 on a hack target, and 90 damage over time. The time is cut in half if the target is hacked, and the cooldown is 6 seconds. Thankfully, Virus is fairly simple. The simplest and best way to describe it is as an accentuator. It accentuates or complements what you're already doing. Whether that's poking at a distance, or going for a backline kill, or dueling for a target on a flank, all of which is covered in my playstyle section, Virus helps along with that. The biggest thing with Virus is actually landing it. People often get obsessed and greedy for hacking a target first and then virusing, but then they just miss the virus and then the hack is meaningless. The best piece of advice I can give with Virus, which I've never heard in any other Sombra guide, is patience. Don't toss it out to deal the damage immediately unless you're fairly confident that it's gonna hit. It's why after you exit stealth, you'll open up an engagement with Virus, because the target you're going for isn't trying to dodge and avoid your damage. It's kinda the same with Sojourn's Railgun. People often miss it, not because they're mechanically bad, but just because they rush it and don't take their time to hit the shots. The same is true with Virus, and it's all about trigger discipline really. Sombra's third ability, Hackerman, makes Sombra temporarily disable all active and passive abilities from one enemy for 1.5 seconds. Your hack has a range of 15 meters, a cast time of just over a second, and a 6-second cooldown. In terms of tech, similar to Mercy's Beam, there is a small grace period where your hack can extend beyond the 15-meter distance. Nice to do if you need to keep the range. In terms of usage, there's 3 rudimentary uses of Sombra's hack. The first is to just farm ult charge or farm the enemy tank. An example would be hacking a Hog or a Diva and farming them from range. They either have limited range or a lack of mobility to flush you out, allowing you to safely farm them at a distance. You also get that buffed virus damage, which is nice too, and I'll speak about this tank frontline playstyle more in the playstyle section. The other type of hack is for a calculated, lethal, surgical burst damage kill, but this usage is actually quite uncommon in your rank games because of the elephant in the room. When you hack someone, you come out of Invis. This gives people time to react to you, which means it becomes much harder to hit the virus. You might not even get the hack off in time, and you might even get forced out too early. That's why you should only really hack someone with a purpose. Again, Questron spoke about this beforehand, but you really need to have a good reason to hack a target and get that temporary disable of cooldowns. The most obvious case is for a coordinated dive or a hit onto a target where you don't want your Doomfist or Winston tanking a sleep dart or a nade during the dive. Or maybe you hack a Sojourn so she can't power slide away, or an Echo so she can't fly away, etc. You're seeing some examples in the background gameplay of these coordinated dive hacks, and this is from a pretty high level tier 3 scrim. Tier 3 is basically high GM before season 9. In terms of the targets you want to hack, probably someone squishy and or probably someone dangerous. I don't think it matters too much specifically because I'm not going to yell at you if you hack and dive a Bastion over a Baptiste or vice versa. Your team just need to be shooting the same target and your fundamentals still need to be there. Onto the third use of your hack, and that's disabling. Shutting down ultimates that are channeling, like Sigma's Flux, or Moira's Coalescence, or Cassidy's High Noon. This overlaps with the previous usage too, but this is more so referring to specific disables. This also does include EMP, believe it or not. There was this clip of Chronic managing to translocate an EMP and then counter EMP afterwards. This does look like crazy reaction time and it is very hard to pull off, but as OC says, this play is mainly down to planning. Knowing the Sombra as EMP, knowing to save Translocate, and actively looking for the enemy Sombra Translocator. Sombra's ultimate, Hackerman 2000, makes Sombra discharge electromagnetic energy in a 15-meter radius with a roughly half-second cast time, lasting 8 seconds, and applying a 3-second disable to anyone caught inside the radius. You also deal 25% of damage to their current HP pool. I think this has been the most consistent part of Sombra's kit ever since I released in Overwatch 1, because the most important tip, timing, still applies. It doesn't matter if you get a 5-man EMP if there's no follow-up, simply put. This links back into my dive guide where I talk about trying to avoid forcing plays, and that EMP can actually be very opportunistic. I think a lot of players have EMP as this massive set play ultimate, but you can use it like Pulse Bomb. It's sure as hell a lot more reliable than Pulse Bomb, and if you want to blow up just a single target, by all means, that's a perfectly fine usage of EMP in my eyes. Something to mention is to please not throw your Translocator before you EMP. That is your escape card, I hope you realise. Just set up behind the enemy team in Invis, or drop from high ground, then EMP. Moving on to the final section of this guide, positioning, playstyle and composition. Likewise to my Reaper guide, I'll start off with the playstyle stuff first. In my original Sombra guide, I started off by going through an example on Oasis City Centre, which I still think applies because it gives a good rundown of Sombra's playstyles. Say you're playing Sombra against a Lucio, Moira, Ryan, Tracer, Ashe based comp. Here you have a few options, and some are certainly better than others. And this refers back to the question I put at the start about who do you target. The first option or playstyle that you have is to mirror or clear flankers. Mirroring just means matching or facing them, so here, if their Tracer decides to flank onto your backline, you could clear her out by throwing a virus out of Invis and getting the jump onto their Tracer. You can see me doing that here on Numbani Attack. So why would you ever want to do this? Well, there's a few cases. If you're running Sombra Tracer against something like a Cash Tracer, because you have more mobility than the enemy Cassidy, you can directly 2v1 their Tracer. Simple, right? Well, not quite. If their Tracer is playing within line of sight of their hit scan, so it's an Ashe in this example, but it could very well be a Sojourn or a Cassidy, then the matchup becomes disadvantageous. However, if the Tracer hasn't got LOS to a Cassidy, then the 2v1 becomes more viable. There's an example here on Suravasa where Pigboy, yes, the real Pigboy from Super's videos, does the incorrect playstyle. He goes straight for backline, but instead he should have just cleared out the Tracer, then he can go for backline. Why? Because their Tracer has no LOS to their team. Another case is if your backline is very squishy. If you're running like an Ana Zen backline, you can help keep them alive and prevent their Tracer from staging a dive onto your Ana Zen, who are very squishy. You also do this playstyle just generally. In my dive guide, I spoke a lot about forcing out flankers first, then going for backline. It's just the safer playstyle and you can always go for backline later. Otherwise, you just trade backlines and it becomes a dogfight. The second option is going for those backline supports. This isn't really a viable option here, mostly because Lucio and Moira are slippery supports who also don't have much range. Not to mention, they're not really going to be influencing the first playstyle of mirroring or forcing out flankers generally speaking. Now, the range is also important here because for the third option, farming down their tank from high ground, a Lucio and Moira just don't have the range to deal with you. You're in this middle ground where you have more range than a Lucio and Moira, but less range than a Zen Ana or a Bap Zen. There's two other cases where you'll do this frontline playstyle. The first of which is in the Malga comp, which we saw towards the end of stage 1, and it was very short-lived. Essentially, the Sombra stacked on top of the Malga, and it was just a race to farm EMP. The reason for this was that Malga just provided too much sustain on the front line, and if the Sombra flanked, she would just get forced out easily, and you're just losing out on frontline damage. The second case is actually just blowing up dive tanks. You'll see some examples of Pigboy do this in the background, but you can either EMP or hack the enemy Winston, and as long as you're a follow-up, you're gonna blow up the enemy tank 9 times out of 10. And lastly, back to the Oasis example, here comes in the fourth option with Ashe. If you stand on the high ground farming the Reinhardt, the Ashe does have enough range to toss a dynamite and potentially kill you, or at least force out a Translocate. As a result, your option here is to duel the Ashe, potentially getting behind, landing a hack from Invis, and then blitzing her down with Virus, or Translocating aggressively, using your Virus and your Uzi, then dropping down if you get forced out. So that's a lot of macro obviously, and knowing which playstyle to do can be very hard. The most important thing to note is that you can dynamically switch playstyles as the fight progresses, which I'll show an example of in just a second. Very generally speaking, in dive mirrors, you're playing to force out flankers, then go for backline. Against Brawl comps, you're looking to play more of that frontline soft off angle playstyle, and against poke comps, you're looking to play more like a Tracer and go for backline or isolated targets. Now, before I end things off, some quick notes on your timing and positioning. With positioning, I have these 4 rules that I always use: cover, line of sight, distance, and rotations. In the background, you're seeing those principles applied to Venture, but with rotation specifically, here's a visual example I want to go over. This also showcases the dynamism in playstyles, which is what I was talking about beforehand. Here, you can see me do that frontline playstyle, hacking the Doom and forcing him out. But after that, I rotate to high ground with my Translocator, and do that backline playstyle onto the Kiriko, Translocating back to high ground. This clip pretty much encompasses a ton of the Sombra macro that we've gone over in this guide. The dynamism in playstyles, not being scared to use Translocator early, using Translocator to stage the high ground, and then using it to escape, and using Virus immediately from Invis. Obviously, when I go onto the Kiriko here, I don't have cover, but that's mainly due to the map geometry. And lastly, going over your timing. As always, the general principle is the more aggressive the play, the later it needs to be timed. Again, that Gibraltar clip is a good example. I make an aggressive play onto the Kiriko and get away with it because it's timed later into the fights. There is one exception where you can actually go early, and that's forcing point on Sombra. Say your team is struggling to push Immobile first. You can just force the point early, which makes the enemy team kite back, translocate out, and then your team have more space. You can also do this on Paraiso as well. Well, that's it for the guide. If you enjoyed, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if this video helped to raise your IQ, be sure to share it with your friends to also raise theirs. Until next time.